There is a secret in this story that most people won't see coming, and when it finally comes out, everything changes. When Homel3ss died, she was worth $3.2 billion. She had no children, no husband, no living relatives, but she left everything to a 12-year-old boy who slept under a highway overpass. The only condition was that he had to read her will out loud at her funeral, in front of 500 people. And when he got to page 7, the room went dead silent. Hey there, welcome back. Before this story begins, do us a favor. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from Canada, Johannesburg, maybe Jamaica or Houston? We'd love to know. Now let me take you back about 2 years before that funeral, to a city called Whitmore, about 90 minutes west of Atlanta, Georgia. Whitmore was one of those places that looked like two different towns depending on which side of the railroad tracks you were standing on. The north side had the money. Big houses behind iron gates, country clubs with golf carts humming through the morning fog, a downtown with boutique shops and wine bars, and a farmer's market every Saturday where people paid $9 for a loaf of bread that had rosemary in it. The south side had everything else. Pawn shops, check-cashing places, a laundromat that closed at 6, and a stretch of road under Highway 14 where people who had nowhere else to go set up tents and cardboard shelters and tried to stay invisible. On the north side, at the very top of a hill on a street called Briarcliff Lane, sat the largest house in Whitmore. It was old, built in 1927, 3 stories of gray stone with tall, narrow windows and ivy climbing up the east wall, and a front door made of dark wood so heavy it took 2 hands to open. The garden was enormous, half an acre of dogwood trees and azalea bushes, and a stone fountain in the center that had a little carved bird on top with its wings spread open. The whole property smelled like magnolia and fresh-cut grass, and something older underneath, like the wood of the house itself was breathing. That house belonged to Homel3ss. Eleanor was 81 years old when this story begins. She was thin, 5'4", with white hair she kept in a tight bun at the back of her head, held in place by a single pearl pin that had belonged to her mother. Her skin was pale and papery, the kind that bruises if you look at it too hard, and she had sharp blue eyes that could make a grown man look at his shoes. She wore the same style of clothes every day, a high-collared blouse, a long wool skirt, and flat leather shoes that clicked when she walked on the hardwood floors. She had a gold watch on her left wrist that she wound every morning at exactly 6:15, and she had a habit of tilting her head slightly to the right when she was listening to someone, like a bird deciding whether to trust you. Homel3ss had built Maddox Consolidated from a single textile factory she inherited from her father into one of the largest private holding companies in the Southeast. She owned manufacturing plants, shipping operations, commercial real estate, and a chain of regional banks. Her net worth, according to the estimates that she never confirmed because she considered it vulgar to discuss money, was $3.2 billion. But here's the thing about Eleanor that the business magazines never understood, and the society pages always got wrong. She didn't care about the money. She never had. She cared about the work. She cared about making things. She cared about the factory floor more than the boardroom. She used to visit her plants twice a month, walking through in her flat shoes, asking workers about their children, remembering their names, stopping to watch a machine run because she still found it beautiful, the rhythm of it, the purpose of it. She once fired a plant manager because she found out he had removed the break room microwave to save $40 a month on electricity. She said, "A company that won't let its workers heat their lunch doesn't deserve workers." Eleanor had never married, not because nobody asked, because nobody understood. She had loved once, a long time ago, a man named Joseph Crane who taught music at a public school in Macon. Joseph was gentle and funny and could play piano like the keys were part of his hands. They dated for 2 years in their 30s. He proposed on a Sunday evening in her garden, right beside the stone fountain, with a ring he had saved for 18 months to buy. Eleanor said yes. 3 weeks later, Joseph was killed in a car accident on Highway 75 during a rainstorm. He was 36 years old. Eleanor never took off the ring. She wore it on her right hand for 45 years. She never dated again. She never explained why. She once told her housekeeper, a woman named Betty Jean, "When you've had the real thing, everything else feels like a costume." Betty Jean had been with Eleanor for 28 years. She was 63, broad-shouldered with deep brown skin, kind eyes, and hands that could iron a blouse so perfectly it looked painted on. She wore her church shoes in the house because Eleanor's floors deserved respect, she said, and she hummed gospel songs while she worked, low and steady, like a motor that kept the whole house running. She knew Eleanor better than anyone alive. She knew that Eleanor ate the same breakfast every morning: one boiled egg, one slice of dry toast, black coffee. She knew that Eleanor kept Joseph's piano in the front parlor and had it tuned every 6 months, even though nobody played it. She knew that Eleanor went to the garden fountain every evening at 7 o'clock and sat on the stone bench and stayed for exactly 20 minutes, rain or shine, winter or summer, without speaking. And she knew that Eleanor was sick. Now, you might be wondering how a 12-year-old homeless boy fits into the life of an 81-year-old billionaire. Pay attention to what happens next. The boy's name was Micah James. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with skinny arms and big brown eyes and a gap between his front teeth that made his smile look wider than his face. He had short hair that he kept as neat as he could, and he wore the same outfit most days: a red hooded sweatshirt that was 2 sizes too big, jeans with holes in both knees, and a pair of sneakers that were held together on the left foot with duct tape. He had a scar on his right forearm, a long, pale line from a piece of broken glass he had cut himself on when he was 9, climbing through a fence at night trying to find somewhere warm to sleep. Micah lived under the Highway 14 overpass with his grandmother, a woman named Ruthie James. Ruthie was 58, but she looked older. Life had pressed down on her so hard and for so long that her body had started to curve under the weight. She had swollen knees and a cough that never fully went away, and hands that shook in the morning until the sun warmed them up. She and Micah had a tent, the kind you buy at a discount store for $30, set up against the concrete wall of the overpass where the rain couldn't reach unless the wind blew sideways. They had 2 sleeping bags, a plastic bin with their clothes, a small cooler, and a Bible with a cracked spine that Ruthie read from every night by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Ruthie had raised Micah since he was 2. His mother, Ruthie's daughter Janelle, had died of an overdose in a motel bathroom when Micah was 22 months old. His father was unknown. Ruthie took that baby boy and promised God and herself and the empty room she was standing in that she would keep him safe. And she had kept that promise for 10 years, through evictions and shelters and food banks, and 2 winters when they slept in a car that didn't run. But here is what you need to know about Micah. Despite everything, despite the tent and the duct tape shoes and the nights when dinner was crackers and peanut butter from a church pantry, that boy could read like fire. Ruthie had taught him. She had been a teacher's aide before everything fell apart, and she believed with every ounce of her tired body that reading was the one thing nobody could take from you. She took Micah to the public library every single day. The library was warm and free, and the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Odom, let Micah stay as long as he wanted. He read everything: adventure stories, science books, history, poetry. He loved poetry. He would read poems out loud to Ruthie at night in the tent, his voice rising and falling with the words, and Ruthie would close her eyes and listen, and for a few minutes the concrete wall behind them disappeared, and they were somewhere else entirely. Micah also had a notebook, a cheap composition book with a black and white marbled cover that Mrs. Odom had given him. He wrote in it every day. Not a diary. Stories. He wrote stories about people who found treasure in unexpected places, people who built castles out of nothing, people who were invisible until one day someone finally saw them. And that is the thing about Micah. He was invisible. The whole town walked past him every single day. People drove over that overpass on their way to work, on their way to the grocery store, on their way to their warm houses and their soft beds, and they never looked down. They never saw the tent. They never saw the boy with the red sweatshirt and the composition notebook and the gap-toothed smile. He was 12 years old, and the world had already decided he didn't matter. But Eleanor Maddox saw him, and that single moment set off a chain of events nobody could stop. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Eleanor's driver, a quiet man named Samuel who had worked for her for 19 years, was taking her home from a doctor's appointment. They passed under the Highway 14 overpass, the same route they always took, and Eleanor happened to look out the window at the exact moment that Micah was sitting on an overturned bucket near the edge of the overpass, reading a book. His legs were crossed. His sneakers were dangling. The red sweatshirt was pulled up over his ears because it was cold, and he was so deep in that book that he didn't notice the black car passing by. Eleanor said, "Samuel, stop the car." Samuel pulled over. Eleanor looked through the window at that boy for a long time. She said, "How old do you think he is?" "Hard to say, ma'am. Maybe 11 or 12. "He's reading," Eleanor said, as if that detail was the most important thing in the world. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Take me home. But tomorrow, I want to come back here." She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 2 weeks, Eleanor had Samuel drive her to the overpass at the same time every afternoon. She watched Micah read. She watched Ruthie hang a damp towel on a rope strung between 2 support columns. She watched the 2 of them share a meal from a paper bag, sitting on the ground with their legs crossed, talking and sometimes laughing, and the sound of that laughter coming from under a highway overpass did something to Eleanor's heart that she couldn't explain. On the 15th day, she got out of the car. Samuel tried to stop her. He said, "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Samuel," Eleanor said, in that voice that ended conversations, "I have walked through factories and boardrooms and the offices of governors. I think I can walk under a bridge." She walked across the gravel. Her flat shoes crunched on the broken glass and loose stones. Micah looked up from his book. Ruthie stood up slowly, her knees popping, her eyes wary. She put herself between Eleanor and Micah, the way she always did when a stranger approached. Protecting him. Always protecting him. Eleanor stopped about 10 feet away. She looked at Ruthie and said, "Good afternoon. My name is Eleanor. I noticed your grandson reading from my car. May I ask what book he's enjoying?" Ruthie studied her. She saw the expensive clothes, the pearl pin, the gold watch. She saw a rich woman from the other side of the tracks. But she also saw something else. She saw the way Eleanor was looking at Micah. Not with pity. Not with charity. With recognition. Like she was looking at something she understood. Ruthie said, "He's reading A Wrinkle in Time, for the 3rd time." Eleanor's face changed. Something softened behind those sharp blue eyes. She said, "That was my favorite book when I was his age. I read it 4 times. Micah looked up. He said, "I like the part where Meg has to go back alone. Everybody thinks she's too young, but she's the only one who can do it." Eleanor tilted her head to the right. She looked at that boy with his duct-tape shoes and his gap-toothed smile and his big brown eyes, and she said, "That's my favorite part too." But what happened next changed everything. Eleanor started visiting every week. She brought books, not children's books, real books, poetry collections, novels, biographies. She brought a hardcover copy of Langston Hughes that she had owned for 50 years, with notes in the margins in her own handwriting. She gave it to Micah and said, "This book changed how I saw the world when I was not much older than you. Be careful with it. Those notes are private." Micah held that book like it was made of glass. He read it in 2 days. He came back to Eleanor with his composition notebook and showed her a poem he had written after reading Hughes. It was about a boy who lived under a bridge and looked up at the sky through the cracks in the concrete and saw stars that nobody else could see. Eleanor read that poem 3 times. She took off her reading glasses and pressed them against her chest and looked at Micah and said, "Young man, this is better than anything I wrote at 12, and I was considered gifted." Micah grinned. "You wrote poems?" "Terrible ones," Eleanor said. "Full of big words I didn't understand. Yours is better because it tells the truth." Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Eleanor didn't just bring books. She brought food. Real meals from her own kitchen that Betty Jean cooked and packed in containers. Roast chicken, cornbread, collard greens, sweet potato pie. She brought blankets when November came and the nights got cold. She brought a proper winter coat for Micah, dark blue, his size, with a warm lining and a hood that actually kept the rain out. She brought thick socks and waterproof boots for Ruthie. But she did something else too. Something quiet. She enrolled Micah in school. She called the principal of Whitmore Middle School, a man named Dr. Homel3ss, and said, "I have a 12-year-old boy who reads at a 10th grade level and writes poetry that would make your English teachers weep. He needs to be in your school. I will cover all costs, supplies, transportation, uniforms, meals, tutoring if needed. His name is Micah James, and I expect him to be treated with the same respect as every other student in that building." Dr. Morris said, "Mrs. Maddox, we'd be happy to—" "I'm not finished," Eleanor said. "If I hear that any teacher, any student, or any staff member has made that boy feel less than because of where he sleeps at night, I will make sure this school receives so much attention that every person in this county will know about it. Are we clear?" They were clear. Micah started school the following Monday. He was nervous. He wore his new coat and his new boots, and he carried his composition notebook in a backpack that Eleanor had bought him, a sturdy black one with extra pockets. Ruthie walked him to the bus stop. She straightened his collar and said, "You listen to your teachers, you work hard, and you remember who you are." Micah said, "Who am I, Grandma?" Ruthie held his face in her shaking hands. "You are Micah James. You are smart, and you are kind, and you are loved. And don't you let anybody in that building tell you different." He got on the bus. He sat in the front seat. He looked out the window as the overpass got smaller behind him, and he opened his composition notebook and wrote one line at the top of a blank page. "Today, I am going somewhere." But the biggest secret hadn't come out yet, because Eleanor Maddox was dying. She had pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She had been diagnosed 8 months before she first saw Micah reading under that bridge. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 14 months, with treatment. Eleanor refused treatment. She told her doctor, a man named Dr. Layton, who had known her for 30 years, "I am 81 years old and I have lived exactly the life I wanted. I am not going to spend my last months in a hospital being poked and poisoned. I am going to spend them being useful." Being useful. That was her phrase. The same 2 words she used when she talked about work, about purpose, about the reason she got up every morning at 6:15 and wound her watch and ate her boiled egg and went out into the world. Only 3 people knew she was dying. Dr. Layton, her lawyer, a woman named Catherine Hale, and Betty Jean, who had found Eleanor on the bathroom floor one morning in September, too weak to stand, and had helped her up without saying a word, and brought her tea, and sat with her until the color came back to her face. Eleanor didn't tell Micah. She didn't tell Ruthie. She just kept showing up. Every Wednesday. Books and food and conversation. She listened to Micah's poems. She asked about school. She watched him grow week by week, from a boy who kept his eyes down to a boy who could look a stranger in the face and say hello. And she revised her will. Catherine Hale came to the house on Briarcliff Lane on a Tuesday evening in January. She sat in the front parlor, across from Joseph's piano, and Eleanor told her exactly what she wanted. Catherine listened. Then she said, "Eleanor, this is going to cause problems." "Good," Eleanor said. "The board of directors will contest it. Let them. People will say you weren't in your right mind." Eleanor looked at Catherine with those blue eyes and said, "Catherine, I have been in my right mind for 81 years and it has been exhausting. I am doing this because it is right. Now write it down." Catherine wrote it down. If you think that was shocking, wait until you hear what happened at the funeral. Eleanor Maddox died on a Sunday morning in April. She died at home, in her bed, in the house on Briarcliff Lane. Betty Jean was beside her. The window was open and the smell of magnolia was coming through, and the morning light was falling across Joseph's piano in the front parlor, and the stone fountain in the garden was running, the little carved bird with its wings spread, catching the light. Her last words, according to Betty Jean, were, Tell the boy I said the poem was beautiful. The funeral was held 5 days later at Whitmore First Baptist Church, the largest church in town. 512 people attended. Business leaders, politicians, bank executives, factory managers, society women in black dresses and pearl earrings. The front 3 rows were reserved for the board of directors of Maddox Consolidated, 12 men and women in dark suits who looked appropriately solemn and were already, privately, discussing what would happen to the company now. But there was one empty chair in the front row, on the left side. It had a small card on it that read, "Reserved, MJ." At 10 minutes before the service began, the side door of the church opened. Micah James walked in. He was wearing a dark suit that Eleanor had bought him 2 months before she died. She had taken him to a tailor in Atlanta, a quiet old man who measured Micah carefully and called him "young sir," and made him a suit that fit perfectly. Micah had asked why he needed a suit. Eleanor said, "Every man needs one good suit. You'll know when to wear it." He knew now. Micah walked to the front row. He sat down in the reserved chair. He had his composition notebook in his lap and a sealed envelope that Catherine Hale had given him that morning. Ruthie sat directly behind him, wearing a dress that Betty Jean had brought to the overpass 3 days ago. Navy blue with small white buttons. The nicest thing Ruthie had worn in 5 years. The service was long. People spoke about Eleanor's business achievements, her philanthropy, her contributions to the community. They used words like visionary and pioneer and pillar. They talked about buildings and numbers and legacies measured in dollars. Then Catherine Hale stood up. She walked to the podium. She adjusted the microphone. She said, "Eleanor Maddox left specific instructions for this service. She requested that her last will and testament be read aloud, in its entirety, by a person of her choosing. That person is here today." She looked at Micah. The room shifted. 500 people turned to look at a 12-year-old boy in a new suit sitting in the front row of a billionaire's funeral. Whispers moved through the pews like wind through tall grass. Who is that? What is this? Is this some kind of joke? Micah stood up. His hands were shaking. He could feel every pair of eyes in that church pressing against him like heat. He walked to the podium. He was so short he had to stand on the step behind it to reach the microphone. He opened the envelope. He unfolded the pages. He looked out at the room full of strangers, and he began to read. The first 6 pages were what you would expect. Legal language. Distributions to Betty Jean, 25 years of salary and a lump sum, and the right to live in the house on Briarcliff Lane for the rest of her life. A trust for the employees of Maddox Consolidated, guaranteeing their pensions. A donation to the Whitmore Public Library. A scholarship fund at Whitmore Middle School. Gifts to 3 hospitals and 2 universities. The room nodded along. This was normal. This was Eleanor. Then Micah turned to page 7. He read the words slowly, clearly, the way Ruthie had taught him, the way Eleanor had praised him for. He read every word as if it mattered, because Eleanor had told him once that every word matters, especially the ones people don't want to hear. Page 7 said this: "To the members of the Board of Directors of Maddox Consolidated, I leave the following. The knowledge that for the past 11 years you have been systematically redirecting company profits into personal investment accounts through a subsidiary called Briar Shelf Holdings, which I have known about since its creation. I have documented every transaction, every board meeting where it was discussed in my absence, every dollar. The documentation has been delivered to the Georgia Attorney General's office, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and 3 independent forensic accounting firms. You have stolen from my company. You have stolen from my workers. And you did it because you thought an old woman in flat shoes was too old and too tired to notice." The church went dead silent. Micah kept reading. His voice didn't waver. His hands had stopped shaking. Something about the words steadied him, like they were bigger than he was, and all he had to do was carry them. I noticed everything. I noticed when you reduced factory workers' health benefits to fund your bonuses. I noticed when you closed the daycare program at the Whitmore plant to save $200,000 while approving a $4 million renovation of the executive offices. I noticed when you fired Teresa Colvin, my best plant manager, because she reported safety violations that would have cost money to fix. I noticed. And I kept quiet. Not because I was weak, because I was waiting. Because I wanted every piece of evidence in order before I acted. And now I am acting. Micah turned the page. Effective upon my death, controlling interest in Maddox Consolidated, 51% of all shares, is transferred to the Maddox Workers' Trust, a new entity managed by an independent board that includes 3 elected worker representatives, 2 community members, and 1 appointee chosen by my personal designee. The employees of this company built it with their hands and their time and their lives. It belongs to them. It has always belonged to them. I am simply correcting the record. The board members in the front rows were white as the lilies on the altar. One of them, a man named Garrett Bishop, the board chairman, stood up as if to object. Catherine Hale, standing to the side of the podium, said calmly, "Mr. Bishop, if you interrupt this reading, you will be removed from this church. Please sit down." Bishop sat down. Micah kept reading. "And finally, I leave the remainder of my personal estate, my home, my savings, and my name, to Micah James, age 12, of Whitmore, Georgia. Not because he is poor, not because I pity him, because in 7 months of knowing this boy, he showed me more courage, more grace, and more hunger for life than anyone I have met in 81 years of living. He reads poetry under a highway overpass and writes stories about people who find treasure in unexpected places. He is the unexpected treasure. And I am trusting him to do what I could not, to grow up in a world that tried to make him invisible and refused to disappear." Micah's voice cracked on the last word. He stopped. He looked up from the pages. 500 people were staring at him. Some of them were crying. Some of them were furious. Some of them were both. He looked down at the last paragraph. He took a breath, and he read it. "To whoever is listening, I want you to know something. I was the richest woman in this town. I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But the richest day of my life was a Wednesday afternoon in October, when I stopped my car under a highway overpass and met a boy who was reading a book. He looked up at me and said, 'I like the part where she goes back alone.' And I thought, yes, that is exactly what courage looks like. Going back alone. Micah, if you are reading this, and I hope you are, I want you to know that you saved me. Not from dying. Nobody saves you from that. You saved me from dying without purpose. You gave an old woman with flat shoes and a wound she had carried for 45 years a reason to get up in the morning. And the poem you wrote about the boy who sees stars through the cracks in the concrete, that is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. I kept it in my Bible. It is there now. I love you, Micah. I love you the way I would have loved my own child if God had given me one. Live big, build castles, and never, ever let anyone tell you that you don't matter, because you matter to me, and I am a very good judge of character." Micah folded the papers. He placed them on the podium. He stepped down from the step. He walked back to his chair. He sat down. He put his hands in his lap. His face was wet, but his back was straight. Behind him, Ruthie was sobbing. Not from sadness, from something bigger than sadness. From the sound of her grandson's voice reading words written by a woman who had looked at a boy the world threw away and said, "No, this one matters. Stay with us, because what happens next will shock you." The aftermath of Eleanor Maddox's funeral shook Whitmore like an earthquake. The board of directors hired 3 different law firms to contest the will. They argued Eleanor was mentally incapacitated. They argued she had been manipulated by a child. They argued the transfer of shares was illegal. Catherine Hale had anticipated every single challenge. Eleanor had undergone 4 separate cognitive evaluations in her final year, all administered by independent physicians, all confirming she was sharp as a blade. The will had been witnessed by 3 attorneys and notarized twice. The evidence against the board, the documentation of Briar Shelf Holdings, was so thorough that 2 board members resigned before the legal proceedings even began. Garrett Bishop fought the hardest. He gave interviews to the local paper, calling Eleanor's will the delusion of a dying woman. He called Micah a prop. He said the company would collapse without experienced leadership. He was wrong. The Maddox Workers' Trust took control within 6 months. The independent board hired a new CEO, a woman named Dr. Frances Okafor, 57, a former manufacturing executive who had spent her career fighting for worker-owned business models. Within a year, she had restored the health benefits, reopened the daycare program, rehired Teresa Colvin as operations director, and increased production by 14%. The workers who now had a stake in the company worked harder, not because they were told to, but because it was theirs. Garrett Bishop was indicted on 7 counts of embezzlement. His trial lasted 3 weeks. He was found guilty on 5 counts. He was sentenced to 9 years. And Micah? Micah moved into the house on Briarcliff Lane with Ruthie and Betty Jean. The 3 of them, a 12-year-old boy, a 58-year-old grandmother, and a 63-year-old housekeeper, lived together in that big stone house with the magnolia trees and the fountain with the little bird. It should have been strange. It wasn't. Betty Jean cooked breakfast every morning, boiled eggs and toast and coffee for her and Ruthie, pancakes for Micah because Eleanor had left a note in the kitchen that said, "The boy likes pancakes. Make sure there are always pancakes." Ruthie took the bedroom on the 2nd floor with the big window that looked out over the garden. She slept in a real bed for the first time in 4 years. She told Betty Jean that the first night she woke up every 2 hours because the mattress was so soft she kept thinking she was falling. By the 3rd night, she slept 8 hours straight and woke up crying because she had forgotten what it felt like to not be tired. Micah kept going to Whitmore Middle School. He walked in every morning with his black backpack and his composition notebook. Some kids treated him differently after the funeral. Some tried to be his friend because of the money. Some were cruel, the way children can be when they don't understand something. One boy said, "You only got that stuff because the old lady felt sorry for you." Micah looked at him and said, "She didn't feel sorry for me. She read my poems. Can you say the same?" The boy had nothing to say to that. Micah kept writing. He wrote a poem the week after the funeral that Mrs. Odom, the librarian, framed and hung on the library wall. It was called The Overpass, and it was about a boy who lived under concrete and learned to read the sky through the cracks. The last line said, "The ceiling was broken. That's how the light got in." One evening in late summer, Micah was sitting on the bench beside the stone fountain in the garden. The little carved bird's wings caught the sunset light and turned gold. Betty Jean was in the kitchen. Ruthie was reading her Bible on the porch. The magnolia trees were full and heavy, and the air smelled like flowers and warm stone. Micah opened his composition notebook. He turned past his stories and his poems until he found a blank page. He started writing a letter. "Dear Miss Eleanor, I read your will like you asked. I didn't mess up too bad. My hands were shaking, but my voice was okay. Grandma said you would have been proud. I'm living in your house now. Betty Jean makes me pancakes every morning. Grandma sleeps in the room with the big window. I sit by the fountain every night because you used to sit here, and I think maybe if I sit here long enough, I'll understand why you picked me. I don't think I'm special. I know you said I was, but I'm just a kid who likes books. But you saw me when nobody else did. You stopped your car. You walked across the gravel in your flat shoes. You asked me what I was reading. Nobody ever asked me that before. I found the poem in your Bible like you said. You wrote a note next to it. It said, 'This is why.' I don't know what that means yet, but I think maybe I will someday. I miss you. I miss Wednesdays. I miss the way you tilted your head when you listened to me, like every word mattered. I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to keep reading. And when I grow up, I'm going to build something. I don't know what yet, but it's going to be something that helps people who are invisible, because you taught me that seeing someone is the most important thing a person can do. Love, Micah." He closed the notebook. He looked at the fountain. The little bird sat there with its wings spread open, the way it had for almost 100 years, reaching for a sky it would never touch but never stopping either. Ruthie came out onto the porch. She called, "Micah, baby, come inside. Betty Jean made sweet potato pie." Micah stood up. He tucked his notebook under his arm. He looked back at the fountain one more time. Then he said quietly, to nobody and to her, "Thank you, Miss Eleanor, for stopping the car." He walked inside. The door closed behind him. The fountain kept running. The magnolia trees held their blossoms up to the last of the light. And inside that house on Briarcliff Lane, in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and butter and something warm that you can't name but you always recognize, a grandmother and a boy and a woman who had loved Eleanor Maddox for 28 years sat down at a table together and ate pie and laughed and were, for the first time in a very long time, home. That's the end of today's story, but the lessons last forever. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and tell us in the comments, which character reminded you of someone in your own life? See you soon.